I've talked about some examples of vocal music that we might see as being through composed. In other words, while setting a particular text, a composer doesn't use all that much repetition, but instead varies their melodies and harmonies and textures to give a sense of the story unfolding from the beginning of the piece to the end. And so you might be wondering, well, do we ever get this idea of through composed structure in pieces of instrumental music? And the answer is yes, we do. And it's kind of interesting to see what those pieces have in common. If we think about what through composed really means, in a way we're saying it doesn't have as strict a form as some of the other things we've been looking at. If we remember Rondo Form, the whole point of Rondo Form is that it has this quite rigid, familiar structure. So we have this thing that's introduced at the beginning, the rondo theme, and then we can expect that to keep coming back, and it's almost like the point of the piece in a rondo is to set us up for the expectation of this A material returning at various different points as we go through the music. But when we talk about something as being through composed, we're really saying there isn't such a strict structure in place, and in some ways we're saying we don't want such a strict form to shape and guide the music as it unfolds. Instead, we maybe want to give a sense of freedom and flexibility. So it's not a coincidence that almost all of the types of instrumental music that we could talk about as being through composed in some way relates to improvisation. Now, what is improvisation? Well, it's not, as some people think, just making stuff up at random, although I can understand why people sometimes think that when they see an amazing jazz saxophonist or a jazz pianist. It really does seem as though they're pulling amazing melodies and structures of music out of the air and they're just choosing stuff at random and putting it together. But instead, of course, it's better to think of improvisation as composing in real time. So instead of spending ages and ages and ages labouring over your score to decide which note might go where, and there's some stories of composers taking 10 years to write a piece of music, improvisation is much more like composing in real time. So you have very, very small amounts of time to make decisions about which notes you're going to use and how you're going to turn those into melodies and even bigger musical structures as well. There are a few types of piece that are kind of associated with improvisation, even if you are writing them down as a composer or you are learning them from a piece of sheet music. There are certain pieces that the composer is probably trying to give you the sense or the impression that it's an improvised piece of music, and the music will have certain things within it that help the audience kind of almost fall for the idea that it's being improvised in real time. So one of those is the Prelude. Now, this doesn't happen all that much anymore, but it used to be the case that when a performer, and particularly a keyboard player, was about to perform a piece of music, what they would do is actually improvise something brand new before they started the proper piece that everyone was there to hear. And the point of this was really to maybe get the audience kind of settled down and ready to hear the music, and also help their hands and fingers and brain warm up to do the kind of difficult music that was about to follow. So a prelude is often not very strictly structured. It has a very free-flowing form, and a lot of the time it doesn't have these very regular repeated patterns that we've seen in some of the other forms that we've been looking at. Instead, they're much more flexible, much freer, and they're much more fluid. And if you listen to the preludes that come before Bach fugues, they're fantastic examples of that sort of playing, where really it's about maybe exploring a particular harmonic idea or a particular pattern of notes or a figuration of notes, and there isn't so much in terms of this really rigid form. Another one of these pieces that we associate with improvisation is a fantasia. So a fantasia is supposedly something that is fantastic. It's something that's come supposedly straight from the brain of the composer onto the page and out into the world, without all these very strict ideas about how things are organised and turning them into rigid structures. So if you hear a fantasia, you're probably, again, thinking along the lines of improvisation, and you're thinking along the lines of something not being all that strictly structured. And finally, Takata, which you might find in the Baroque period particularly, and this is something that's very quick and a very fast piece of music, normally for the keyboard as well, and it's got the sort of music in it, again, that's easy to improvise. So lots of repeated patterns and lots of scales and things that kind of don't require these sort of big, carefully thought out structures that we might find in, say, a rondo form or even a sonata form, which we're just about to go on and have a look at. So it seems that when composers want to give us the sense of a structure, that they've really thought carefully about this piece and that it's something they've sat down and worked on for a long time. They might choose to use one of the more rigid formal structures that we've looked at, like a ternary form, a theme and variations, or a rondo form. But if instead they want to give us the sense, or even fool us into thinking that the performer is just improvising, making the thing up in real time, then they might use one of these more free, through composed type forms like Prelude, Fantasia, and Takata.